Hi everyone. I want to give an overview of chapter 7. And so first off, what is photosynthesis? Photosynthesis is essentially organisms using sunlight to create energy. Now we learned in the previous units that by energy we mean we're storing potential energy, those high energy electrons, in the form of a solid structure. In this case, in photosynthesis, we use solar energy to form carbohydrates, or we can say glucose. Really, we form a carbon skeleton called glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, or G3P, but glucose works. So photosynthesis captures that energy and uses it to speed up electrons and store those electrons in a carbohydrate. When we're talking about photosynthesis, this is occurring, you could think of it as occurring in mostly green organisms. So your plants, your algae, some bacteria, they're photosynthesizing. So they're able to utilize certain proteins to absorb solar energy. The main protein, the main pigment in these chloroplasts is chlorophyll. This is the green photosynthetic pigment. Now, inside of our chloroplast, there's a lot going on inside this little endosymbiont. So let me skip down to this one. So inside of our leaves, chloroplast is where we're going to be absorbing solar energy. That's going to be happening here in these thylakoid membranes. We learned in the previous chapter that cyanobacteria are wrapped in a thylakoid membrane. And it's all these R's, little thylakoid membranes, little pigment complexes, photosystems that are able to absorb solar energy and create energy to power the portion of the cycle that forms the sugar. So one portion is happening inside the thylakoid. The portion where we actually make the sugar is happening out here in the open space, or the stroma. So when you're thinking about photosynthesis, we have to think, what is the basics behind it? Well, the basics is we need carbon and we need water. So water they absorb through the roots, or if you're a plant, where do you get carbon dioxide? Or I'm sorry, I get the way answer. Where do you get carbon? Well, it's carbon dioxide in the air. And so the carbon dioxide diffuses into the plant, and that's the raw ingredients. So if you're going to bake cookies, right, if you're making chocolate chip cookies, one, you need chocolate chips, two, you need flour, and of course butter and things as well. But your raw ingredients for photosynthesis are carbon dioxide and water. Where does the energy come from? Well, energy is supplied by sunlight. So here's the basics of this equation you'll need to be familiar with. We take carbon dioxide and water, and we end up with a carbohydrate, glucose and oxygen. This is an oxidation reduction reaction because we're taking electrons from one compound and putting them into the other. So one substance is oxidized, or losing electrons, and one substance is reduced, they're gaining electrons. The carriers in photosynthesis are going to be ATP, our high energy currency, and the B vitamin battery, that coenzyme, NADP. Now, when we get to chapter 8, we're going to use a substance called NAD and FAD. So how do we keep those separate? Well, here's how I do it. NADP has a P in it. Photosynthesis begins with P. So if I want to know what B vitamin carrier there is in photosynthesis, I look to the one that has the P, NADP, right? All right. Here's some equations. I'm not going to go through the entire PowerPoint. I'm just going to highlight some portions here. So there are two main processes of photosynthesis. One portion where we make energy, one portion where we store energy in batteries to utilize later, and one portion where we actually make the sugar, make the carbohydrate. The portion where we make the B vitamin batteries, make the energy currency, is called the light reaction because it needs sunlight. The portion where we make glucose, make the substance that can be made into glucose, is called the Calvin cycle. So the light reactions occur in the thylakoid. The Calvin cycle occurs out here in the stroma. We're able to absorb sunlight because of certain pigments. Now, it's not just chlorophyll. We have to expand our definitions as we go through each chapter. You'll see that every time we learn something, we get a little bit more detailed as the units go on. So it's not just chlorophyll anymore. There are other pigments, chlorophyll A and B, as well as carotenoids. Well, what word do we see here in carotenoid? Carrot. Carotenoids are orange. So as you'll see when you go through the PowerPoint, the colors that we see, that's the wavelength being reflected back to our eyes. So if it's being reflected, that means they do not absorb that color. So chlorophyll A and B, they're green because they don't absorb that wavelength. They absorb mainly these wavelengths and these wavelengths, your oranges and your reds and your blues and your purples. Carotenoids, they're the ones that are going to absorb from the violet to the green spectrum. And so plants don't just have green. Depending on what plant you are, you can have other accessory pigments. And there exists a whole range that we don't actually get into in this class. Xanthophylls and anthocyanins and all kinds of pigments. Let me skip down. I want to hit some big portions here. We capture light energy in photosystem 1 and 2. Now, when we named these, we discovered photosystem 1 first, but it actually occurs second in the process. So when light energy strikes the thylakoid, photosystem 2, those electrons get excited and they speed up. Let me get to my picture. So light energy strikes photosystem 2, those pigments, an electron is excited and breaks away from that photosystem, is passed down an electron transport chain, and it hits photosystem 1, where another electron gets excited, also absorbing sunlight energy, and it's been bounced around with that new electron from photosystem 2. And we want to store that. We want to keep that high energy electron to use as somewhere else. And so to do that, we put it in a battery. So in this case, NADP, our coenzyme, we connect a hydrogen ion and those electrons to form NADPH, a B vitamin battery. And when we need those electrons, we can oxidize that compound during the Calvin cycle reactions. An important step here, remember this. When we lose this, I'm pointing at my screen as if you can see me. When we lose this this electron from photosystem 2, that has to be replaced. So where do we replace it from? We split apart water. So some oxygen is released. That's why photosynthesis, plants make oxygen. And a hydrogen ion is released when we accept that electron. Those hydrogen ions are important because as the electron flows across the electron transport chain, we use that energy, we use that energy to transport hydrogens. We're storing hydrogens inside of our little thylakoid. Let me get to a picture. And so as that electron flows down the electron transport chain, here's where NADP reductase makes NADPH, we're building up pressure. And so you learned in the previous unit, or you should have, about concentration gradients. And so we know that things want to move from an area of high concentration to low concentration. And so these hydrogen ions move across ATP synthase, allow us to make ATP. That's called chemiosmosis. We've been hearing that word a few times, and we're going to hear it again in cellular respiration as well. The Calvin cycle is an actual cycle that allows us to produce that compound that we can turn into glucose or fructose or amino acids, all kinds of stuff. But it's a cycle, and it requires 3 steps. The first is carbon dioxide fixation. We have to take that gas and turn it into a solid source. To do that, we have to stick it to something. And so we stick carbon dioxide to a sugar called RUBP, or ribulose biphosphate. That sugar's not good enough. It's not what we need. We need G3P. G3P is that skeleton we can use to make glucose, use to make fructose, use to make all kinds of stuff. That's what we want. So what are we going to do? Well, we reduce. Reduce. What is reduce?